Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Voices of Forestry podcast. I'm your host, Seth Stephenson, the communications coordinator with the Arkansas Forestry Association. And today, we're going to be talking about chronic wasting disease, otherwise known as CWD. So if you hear that acronym a lot, it is talking about chronic wasting disease. And today I'm joined by Dr. Jenn Ballard with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. She is the state wildlife veterinarian and assistant chief of research. So Dr. Ballard, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I know we had to move some things around, so I really appreciate you working with me with all the weather that we had here recently. We're recording this on March 1st, and of course the days that we had scheduled got iced out on us out of the blue.
Yeah, crazy weather.
Well, Dr. Ballard, if you don't mind, as always, we like to make sure that our new guests have an opportunity to talk about who they are. So if you could tell the folks who you are, how you got to the position that you're at.
Well, I'm from Arkansas originally. I was born and raised here, and I went to North Little Rock High School and got a bachelor's in wildlife biology from Arkansas Tech University. But I had this dream of being a veterinarian as well, and so I went to the University of Missouri and got a veterinary degree, and went to the University of Georgia after that for a PhD that kind of tied the two together. Mm-hmm. So I have both classical training in wildlife management and veterinary medicine, and I kind of combine those. And my focus at the Game and Fish is really helping our agency manage for healthy wildlife populations. So it's a little bit different than working in a clinic, mm-hmm. but it's the career I've always dreamed of having. So I love it. And what I do at the agency specifically, I help oversee research, but also run a fish and wildlife health program that includes chronic wasting disease, but we do a lot of other things as well, looking at the health of our wildlife resources.
Okay. Now, this is just for my own personal curiosity. When you knew that you wanted to be a veterinarian, had you ever imagined you'd be doing what you're doing now, or did you see yourself like in a clinic working with dogs and cats and the basic household pets?
I don't think I ever really saw myself in a clinic, but
okay.
I did for a long time. I was a volunteer at the Little Rock Zoo, and I dreamed of being a zoo veterinarian.
Oh, okay, awesome. And
then when I got to undergrad and found wildlife management, I just fell in love with that field mm-hmm. as well, and wanted to find a way to combine them.
Okay, cool. Like I said, that was just me. I'm just curious here at this point. Well, cool. Well, Dr. Ballard, let's kind of hop into what exactly chronic wasting disease is. I know this is something that a lot of folks, especially here, who do a lot of hunting or who do own property, have heard a lot about over the past couple of years. But could you just tell us what exactly CWD is?
So chronic wasting disease is a disease that affects members of the cervid family, so deer, elk, moose, things like that. And it's caused by a misfolded protein. It's part of a category of diseases called prion diseases. The protein is a normal component of the mammal body, but when the proteins take on this new shape, they accumulate in the body and cause a fatal disease. And in deer and elk, we call that chronic wasting disease.
Okay. And I guess my next question is, how did this happen? I guess, how did we first get chronic wasting disease here in Arkansas? Because again, I've heard about this for a couple of years now, and I didn't feel like I'd heard about it previously. So is this a relatively new thing that we're seeing?
Well, it was newly detected in 2016. Okay. We had been doing surveillance before that, but we had not found it in the state. But when we did find it, it was already occurring at a relatively high prevalence in our Ozark region around the Buffalo National River. There's a lot of speculation about how the disease was introduced. It would have had to have been introduced. We don't know for sure exactly how it was introduced, but we kind of just focus on what we need to right now mm-hmm. to prevent that disease from having long-term negative impacts on our deer and elk populations, but particularly our deer population.
Okay. And if you could just, if it did get too far, what are some of those ramifications that we would see?
So what's been observed in other states, and it varies. Mm-hmm. So mule deer are probably one of the most studied species, and they've had huge population declines. Now, not extinctions, mm-hmm. but large population declines. In the case of elk, they're a little bit more resistant to the disease, and some of the things that have been measured in elk are failure of the population to grow, and that can have problems when it's combined with other issues. So white-tailed deer, as far as we know, fall in between, and the exact impact that this disease will have on our population is something we're in the process of studying right now. But it could range from population declines to shifts in our population to younger animals as the older animals die out. So we would have less control over our population dynamics, and they would be less able to respond to other issues in their environment, or like elk, they may have a failure to grow properly in response to other opportunities. So it could be a range of effects. It's going to really depend on the prevalence of the disease and the reproductive rate in our herd, and we're in the process of studying that right now.
So I guess I'm asking all this to show that this is something serious. Like this, if we just let it go, it could really damage our deer populations here in the state.
Absolutely. That's one thing we know. We don't know the magnitude of the impact, but we know where this disease occurs at high prevalences. It does impact populations, and they are less likely to thrive and be stable in the long term. And so that's what we're trying to prevent.
Okay. And if you could, how exactly does this folded protein affect the deer physically?
So when the prion takes on that new folded shape, it's really hard for the body to break it down, and it accumulates, and that actually causes the cells in the brain to die. And so as you lose the brain cells over time, and it's a very slow disease process, eventually the animal loses too many and it can no longer survive. So that's what happens in the individual animal. So you'll see signs of they lose weight, and then they get kind of weak and behave abnormally and lose awareness of their surroundings. And so when that happens in the individual, that's fatal. But then when the disease prevalence gets high, it drives up the overall population mortality rate, which is really what we get concerned about.
Okay. And I guess if you could explain why the concern there.
Because if the mortality rate is more than the reproductive rate can compensate for, that's when you start seeing population declines.
I guess what are some of the telltale signs that chronic wasting disease is affecting a herd or an animal specifically?
So the signs at first are very subtle because it's going to be one animal at a time. So you're not going to see big group mortality, which kind of allows it to sneak under the radar for a while. When the disease prevalence gets high, you'll start seeing sick animals on the landscape, but they were probably there in low numbers, sort of in the background. So it can kind of fly under the radar for a while. When you see those sick animals, you see the thinness and unusual behaviors and eventually mortality. And so that sort of progresses over time, but that becomes a more common observation as the disease prevalence goes up.
Okay, so it won't be like a startling thing that's there right out the gate. It'll take time for it to become more noticeable, just from someone who maybe sees a herd of deer on their property.
Exactly. And it's kind of an insidious process. And that's how it can sort of sneak up on you, because it has a low prevalence for a really long time, and then it'll suddenly start climbing very rapidly. But that's not something that happens in 1 year or 5. It's a process that can take several decades. We're talking 40, 50 years. And so when we go to manage chronic wasting disease, we're not looking to the immediate future. We're looking to the long-term herd stability.
Okay, interesting. So then I guess another question that we should have talked about earlier, but I'm going to ask it now, is how does it spread? Is there like one way that it one deer gets it and then it just keeps going and going and going?
It is a contagious disease, and so infected animals shed the misfolded protein in their urine, their feces, and their saliva. Okay. And when that misfolded protein gets into another animal, it causes that animal's normal prion proteins to start taking on that shape. And that's how they become infected and how the disease spreads. So you can have direct transmission from deer to deer, especially within social groups. That can be very efficient, doe to offspring transmission as well. And then it can also accumulate in the environment. And we know that prions are very, very stable in the environment and can remain infectious for years. They don't actually know the outside limit of that, but at least 17 years based on research in Scrapie. So once it's in the environment, especially accumulated in high concentrations, it stays there and infects other animals for a long time.
So is that a naturally occurring protein, or is it just there because a deer had it left its excrement or urine and it just kind of propagated from there?
Well, it won't replicate in the
Okay.
environment.
Okay.
It just stays there.
Gotcha.
So the
Gotcha.
normal prion protein in the body is easily broken down. The misfolded form from infected animals stays in the environment and just hangs out there until it can be taken up by plants or other deer as they're foraging.
Gotcha. Okay. So I guess this brings us now to my earlier question is, what can a landowner, for instance, what can they do if they see something, or what can they do, I guess, as a preventative measure?
Absolutely. So there's several things that hunters and landowners can do, even if they aren't hunters themselves. So one of the most important things they can do is, if a person, anyone, sees sick or unusually dead deer, without an obvious cause, then if they'll just call us, that's very helpful, because those are really efficient samples for surveillance. Those sick deer will come out, we'll test it, and that really helps us identify where the disease is in the state, because our management strategies can be more effective if we start them early. And so it's very important to detect the disease early. So if they want to report a sick animal, they can actually call our poaching hotline. And we have contacts in every county. So that's 1-800-482-9262, but you can find that on our website, but that's the same number as our poaching hotline, and they can call to report sick animals year round, and we'll do our best to come out and respond to as many of those as we can. Other things that folks can do, one of the real issues that we have with this disease is when deer are artificially congregated around baits and feeds, it can increase disease transmission. So if the disease gets introduced into a new place, you can start speeding up that process by artificially congregating deer, but maybe even before the disease is there. So one of the things we like to talk about is, this is just one more great reason to focus on wildlife habitat. Working on wildlife habitat, encouraging deer to use natural forage, it spreads them out, it maintains their social structure, where, using baiting and feeding products interrupts social structure and brings deer into unnatural contacts. So that's another thing they can do, continue working on their great habitat work and provide that food in a more distributed way.
So it's exactly like any disease that we would see. I'm not going to name anything specific, but it's, if you bring a lot of the animals together, it spreads quicker and affects a lot more animals.
Absolutely. That's not even unique to chronic wasting disease, even bovine tuberculosis in other states, and even bird feeders in our backyard. If we don't keep those clean, there are several diseases that can be transmitted by bird feeders. So we know when we congregate wildlife of any kind, we risk increased disease transmission.
Okay. So now, I guess my question here is, so once someone makes a call, say I found a deer carcass on my property that looks a little odd, I've given you guys a call. What happens then? What are you guys doing after that call is made?
So if the carcass is fresh enough, we will come out and we will collect a sample from it. We'll send it to the lab and we'll include it in our surveillance numbers. We have quotas for every county in the state. So we'll just include it in that. If it happened to come back positive, then we could implement various response and management strategies in that area, because if we are able to implement those early, we can suppress disease prevalence, which prevents the negative effects to the population that we were talking about.
Okay. And I guess, how do you guys work on the suppressive side of things?
So it's not an easy disease to manage, but there are some techniques in the scientific literature that are proposed. And there's two. One would be managing CWD through harvest. And so that is having hunters help us manage the disease by the decisions that they make in the way that they harvest animals, and focusing on all age class buck harvest is one of the strategies that we can use. That's why we remove our 3-point rule in our CWD management zone, to encourage hunters to focus on harvesting bucks and to do that without regard to age class, because bucks tend to carry a high prevalence of disease. And so changing the way we harvest deer can help suppress disease prevalence. One of the other things that we can do when we find it early, states like Illinois and Missouri and Tennessee implement these very tight targeted removals. So after the deer season, going in and looking to remove the specific social groups that known positives would have had contact with can really help suppress that prevalence. So it's not a broad culling, it's a close-knit removal of high-risk animals to help slow that spread. And we've implemented that just in a few instances so far, but the cases that are really far away from our existing CWD management zone, we've worked to implement that.
So you mentioned that this disease takes time to really kind of get going on a large group of animals. Since this was really just discovered here in our area around 2016, has it really had time to kind of move through larger herds, or are you just kind of are you getting just a couple here and there, a couple deer here and there?
Unfortunately, even though we only discovered it in 2016, what we found at that time was that we already had a very high disease prevalence in our, what we refer to as our core area, so up around the Buffalo River area. That indicates to us that the disease had been on the landscape for a while, and it took us some time to detect it. Tennessee had a similar experience a few years later. It's a very difficult disease to detect on the landscape because it has a very patchy distribution. So we have about 4 to 5 counties that have a high prevalence, and we're very concerned about the effect that is or will have on our deer herd. Other parts of the state, in surrounding counties, we've only found a few cases, and those appear to be occurring at a much lower prevalence. And so our goal there is to work to keep those areas from having a higher prevalence in the future and moving into that concerning disease prevalence that can affect the population.
Okay.
All of this information is available on our website. We keep up-to-date maps. On our website, you can see exactly where all of our cases are occurring and have been detected. We're absolutely committed to transparency on this issue. So if anyone wants to find that on our website, it's agfc.com/CWD. The highest prevalence counties are Carroll, Madison, Newton, Boone, and Searcy counties. And those are all counties that have at or above a 5% disease prevalence. And where you really start to predict population problems is if you get into a 25 to 30% prevalence, you get really nervous. And that's something we've seen in sort of the Newton County area has the highest prevalence.
So you'll have to forgive me. I'm not looking at a map and my counties aren't quite right. So these are all, so they're all a pretty tight-knit group, or close. All the counties are pretty close together.
With the exception of just this year, we had a detection in Randolph County and a detection down in Union County. And so there may be some new counties, some folks in new areas of the state that are really kind of noticing CWD for the first time. In the case of the Randolph County positive, we know that there was a cluster of positives just across the state line in Missouri. And so it's probably an extension of that. We don't know yet where the Union County case came from, but we're working closely with our partners in Louisiana to do additional surveillance and try to figure out what the source of that may have been, whether it was on our side of the state line or potentially theirs. Okay.
And just for you listeners, I'll make sure to have this link in the description of this episode if you're curious to see the map or to see any more information that Dr. Ballard mentioned. We'll make sure that link is available to you guys pretty easily, and we'll also have that hotline number available for them in the description, so that is also handy for them. And one other thing, too, that I wanted to kind of discuss is that you've mentioned a couple of other states. This isn't just an Arkansas problem. This is happening across multiple states in the country, correct?
Absolutely. There's a national map that the National Wildlife Health Center maintains, but the gist of it is that over half the states in the country are fighting this issue. But it's still a relatively new issue because prior to the year 2000, it was really only known to occur in Colorado and Wyoming, and it was very restricted to a few counties in those states. And so everything else has filled in since the year 2000. So understanding what this is going to do to eastern deer herds, to various species in different ecosystems is something we're still learning a lot about.
Yeah, and that's something I hadn't thought about either, is that, our deer, our Arkansas deer, if you will, I'm not quite sure on the scientific names, but our Arkansas deer are different than Tennessee deer or Colorado deer or what have you. So that difference in physiology has to affect each species a little bit differently, I would imagine, right?
Right. So, in the Southeast, Arkansas and Tennessee, we have white-tailed deer. They do, we have genetic research that shows that they're sort of locally adapted subpopulations. But compared to mule deer in the West or elk or other species of cervids, there are species differences in how they respond. But there's also differences in what their ecosystem will allow them to do in terms of their reproductive rates and how much mortality they can compensate for. So that's why it can be very ecosystem specific, even if it's still white-tailed deer. So from the upper Midwest to the Southeast, there may be some differences in how deer respond.
But I guess the ultimate concern remains the same of the population decline if the CWD gets going too much, I guess, in certain areas.
Right. We worry that a high disease prevalence would either reduce the size of our population, shift it to younger age classes, or just really inhibit its ability to respond to other challenges. And so all of these things, can become cumulative.
Okay. Now, Dr. Ballard, one last thing I wanted to touch on here before we kind of start wrapping up. We've talked a lot about the disease, how it affects the animals, what landowners need to be looking out for, but I was curious as to what you guys, specifically with Game and Fish, have been doing during all of this. You're the assistant chief of research, so I'm sure you've been spending a lot of time with CWD. So what are you guys actively doing to learn more about this disease?
So we have, we've changed our regulations. We've worked with hunters to actively manage it. But in addition to that, we are very committed to helping expand our understanding of this disease for us and for other Southeast states. So we've engaged in a lot of different research projects. I made reference to one earlier, which was our genetics study. We took deer genetics from around the state, compared our populations, and that helps us predict not only where deer move and where genes move, but where the disease can spread. And so that's really helped us not only with CWD, but with our deer management more broadly. And, we've participated in other studies that have compared prion strain types between states, that have looked at the ability of does to transmit CWD to fawns in utero. We provided samples for a study that was looking at that. And we're actually partnered with the University of Georgia and Colorado State University. We're just starting our second year of actually the largest research study that the agency's ever undertaken. Wow. And we are collaring deer in our CWD area and watching their movements and examining if there are differences in the survival, in the movement, and the overall behavior of deer with CWD and deer without CWD. And then from that, we'll be able to look at the effect this is having on our population and model out what our best management strategies will be for the future.
I'm not sure if you have an answer to this question, but I'm curious. Have you guys seen differences in the disease, I guess variations in the disease from state to state or even herd to herd, or is it all pretty much kind of the same thing throughout?
Well, there's been some differences in the responses of herds,
okay.
But really in terms of prion strain type differences, we're really just getting to a place where we're only kind of scratching the surface on that, because prions are really hard to study. When you want to examine a virus or a bacteria, you typically use PCR and you sequence the genetic material of those pathogens. Prions are just proteins. They don't have any genetic material, and we can't use a lot of the technologies that we've used to examine other pathogens. And so part of the delay in this is having to develop new technologies to investigate this whole other category of pathogens, when a lot of our other methods that we've used for many years don't apply to this particular class of disease.
So it's not only a new disease that has been discovered here recently, or at least locally, but it's also something completely different that you guys have had to adapt to over the past couple of years.
Yes, but we're not alone in that.
Yeah.
So this is a very unique prion disease for wildlife, but there are prion diseases in domestic animals, and there are prion diseases in humans. And so fortunately, we can sort of piggyback discoveries between the different prion diseases and apply them across species.
Okay, cool, awesome. I don't say any of this is like an attack, like, hey, what in the world are y'all doing? But it's I find it very fascinating because this is something that I don't do a lot of science talk, but I find it very fascinating, just kind of some of the stuff that you guys are having to do, some of the things that you're having to look for, and just how new, I guess, something like this can be to people like yourself. So. I don't hope you didn't think I was trying to get you or anything.
No, of course not.
Awesome. So Dr. Ballard, I think this kind of wraps everything up. Is there anything else though that you kind of want to add or you want to say before we shut everything down?
Sure. So we kind of talked about what landowners and foresters can focus on to encourage healthy deer herds and not congregate deer and reporting sick animals, but specific to hunters and foresters who may be working with lessees, there are some other things that they can do as well. You know, we offer free testing to hunters for their deer in every county of the state throughout the deer season. And for some hunters, that makes them feel more comfortable about consuming the animal. But even if you're not concerned about that, it really helps us in doing our surveillance and understanding where this disease is occurring. So I would ask, get your deer tested. We really appreciate it. It's a big help. And so that's something we would really like folks to do. Some of the other things they can do is avoid moving carcasses long distances, because the brain, the spinal cord, parts that we don't normally eat can carry prion and introduce them into the environment. So making sure we dispose of all those unwanted parts locally or in line landfills. And there's a list of line landfills on our website. And there's always been rules, never dispose of carcasses in waterways or close to public roads. But I would add just bury them if you can, prevent scavenging, and keep it as local to the location of harvest as possible. That way we're not moving stuff around. And
I'm assuming you guys suggest that no matter if you think your deer has CWD or not, always get it tested if you're able to.
Well, that's a great point. So one of the hallmarks of this disease is a really long incubation period. And I used to have to explain what incubation period was. I don't have to explain it anymore because it's become part of our day-to-day sort of nomenclature. But from the time that a deer becomes infected with CWD to when it actually looks sick can be well over a year, 16 months or more. So just because your animal looks healthy doesn't actually mean that it's CWD free. It means, it could be in that preclinical stage. And so the only way to know for sure is to actually test the animal.
And forgive me if I missed this, but do you suggest getting it tested in the same county that it was harvested as well? Or if I live a county over, can I get it tested there? Or should I get it tested there?
As long as you're not moving out of the tier 1 or tier 2 CWD counties, like we have some carcass movement restrictions that apply to those counties. You can move around within them. You can use as long as you adhere to those carcass movement rules, you can use any freezer anywhere in the state. It doesn't matter which one you bring it to.
And all those rules are on the site as well, correct?
They are at agfc.com/CWD. And next year, before the deer season opens, since it just closed yesterday, we'll have a new map with all the locations, the hours of availability, everything folks need to know about how to get their deer tested. In addition to that, we work with taxidermists around the state. So to have your deer tested, you actually have to drop off the head where we can pull the necessary samples. But if you want to keep the head and have it mounted, you can actually work with one of our taxidermists who will pull the sample and mount the deer for you. And so there's a great list of those on our website.
Okay, cool. And I guess I said we were going to wrap up, but I've got 100 more questions. Now, I guess one thing that I kind of want to ask too is you mentioned that deer season has closed. What do people need to be looking forward to now? I guess, is it just that wildlife management, to be working to try to make natural habitat or natural areas for deer on their land? Is that kind of what they can be doing now in between seasons?
Yeah, that's a great thing to focus on. If it's private land, thinning and burning, or anything to improve habitat, food plots if you want to do those. If you're working with your lessees, making them aware of the testing options in their counties, and anyone can keep an eye out for sick animals and report those. So those are all great things to do.
So a little bit of preparation, a little bit of education, a little bit of looking out.
Yes.
I didn't have another Asian word there for the last one, but well, cool. One final question, and I promise this is the last one. One thing that we do probably need to discuss, talking about testing the animal, especially for those who consume deer, is if not tested properly and consumed, does that affect humans in a certain way, or how does that relationship work?
So I have to give the caveat before I answer that. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission is not a public health agency.
Yes.
So we don't make recommendations for public health.
Okay.
I would say that hunters can visit the Arkansas Department of Health website or the CDC. They actually have dedicated pages for hunters and others who are concerned about chronic wasting disease. Okay. But I can briefly summarize the recommendations that they have made, which is it has never been documented to infect a person. Okay. So that's great news, and we hope it never, ever does. The research in primates and concern for what happened with BSC, which is another called sort of mad cow disease, and another prion disease, where a small number of exposed people did get sick. Because of that, they recommend caution with any prion disease. And so the public health authorities recommend testing deer if you're hunting in a CWD affected area and simply not consuming animals that test positive. The greatest risk of, if transmission could occur, it would be through consumption. And so just not eating them if they test positive is the recommendation.
Okay. Yeah, and I say all that. I wasn't hoping people would go out and just start chomping down, but to use caution. Caution is a big key word here, and to get it tested and just to make sure you know the rules and the research that's out there before doing anything too rash.
Absolutely. I would encourage folks to visit our website, visit the CDC. There's some other great groups like the CWD Alliance. There's lots of groups out there that can provide great information, and people can read up and decide, what's best for them and to make those informed decisions for themselves.
Okay. Well, Dr. Ballard, I appreciate you stopping by today and talking with us about this. I've heard so much about CWD, never really knew quite what it was, so I'm glad I was able to sit down and have this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
Awesome. And we want to thank you guys for joining us this month as well. As always, we want to give a special shout out to Rob McCormick / some guy named Rob for the use of our theme song. That's The Same Love off of his album, The Folkster. You can find more of his music on Spotify and his website. And of course, we'll have a link to his website in the description of this episode if you want to check out more of his awesome music. Well, that's it for us this month. Join us next month as we have a new topic, a new discussion, and a new Voice of Forestry.